It started as an innocent evening, the kind where the air was cool and the world outside was calm. Jason had just returned from work, his mind still buzzing from the chaos of the office. A long day of spreadsheets, emails, and endless meetings had drained him, leaving him eager to retreat to the comfort of his small apartment. The dim light from his kitchen reflected off the stainless steel countertops as he opened the fridge and grabbed a bottle of water. A few days earlier, he'd noticed something strange, a mark on his wrist. It wasn't there before. At least, he didn't remember it being there. It wasn't a bruise or a rash, nothing that would suggest a physical injury. The mark was peculiar, faint but unmistakable, almost like a tattoo. It appeared to be a series of jagged lines that twisted around his skin, forming an almost organic pattern, as though something was slowly carving its way through him. Jason tried to ignore it at first, writing it off as something insignificant. Maybe it was just a small skin irritation, a result of stress, or an allergic reaction. But as the days went on, the mark began to change. It deepened, spreading slightly, as though it were growing. That night, as he sat down on the couch, the weight of the day pressing down on him, he absent-mindedly brushed his fingers over the mark. The sensation was subtle but strange, like an electric current ran beneath his skin. A chill crept up his spine. Jason's mind raced. Was it a disease? A skin condition? But it didn't look like anything he had seen before. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted his sleeve. The mark had now expanded beyond the area of his wrist, spreading toward his forearm. Suddenly, a voice broke through his thoughts, echoing in his mind as clearly as if someone had whispered it directly into his ear. It's not a disease. It's a warning. Jason recoiled, his heart racing. He looked around the apartment, as though expecting someone to be there, but the place was empty. The voice lingered in his mind, the words repeating over and over like a chant, causing a deep, inexplicable fear to settle in his chest. The mark on his skin seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. For a moment, Jason was paralyzed with fear. What did this mean? What was happening to him? He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Maybe it was just his imagination, running wild after a stressful week. Maybe he was just tired. But when he pulled his sleeve back down and turned away from the mirror, he noticed something else. The lights in the room flickered for a brief second. Then, just as quickly, they returned to normal. Jason blinked, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him or if something more sinister was at work. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mark on his skin was somehow connected to whatever was happening. It was as though it was more than just a physical symptom. It was a signal, a key to something far darker. Jason knew that he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to find out what was happening before it was too late. Jason couldn't sleep that night. The strange sensation of the mark pulsing on his wrist kept him awake, gnawing at his mind. It felt like it was alive, as though it had a mind of its own. His thoughts raced, wondering if anyone else had experienced something like this. He thought about Googling it, but something told him that wouldn't be enough. He needed answers that couldn't be found on the internet. The next morning, Jason reluctantly dragged himself out of bed. The mark had grown again overnight, its jagged edges stretching further down his arm. It looked almost like a black vine, curling around his skin. He felt a sickening knot in his stomach as he examined it. His reflection in the bathroom mirror staring back at him with wide, fearful eyes. He had to do something. He couldn't just wait around for whatever was happening to him to take its course. His first instinct was to go to a doctor, but something inside him told him that this wasn't something a doctor could fix. The more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just a physical problem. It was something deeper, something darker. Jason decided to take a walk to clear his head. hoping the fresh air would bring some clarity. He walked aimlessly through the streets of his neighborhood, the early morning fog making everything feel surreal. People were out, going about their daily routines, oblivious to the dark thoughts that were consuming his mind. As he walked, he passed a small church on the corner. The old building had always intrigued him, with its faded stained glass windows and the quiet, almost forgotten presence it exuded. The church had been around for as long as he could remember, but it always seemed out of place, standing there in the middle of the modern city. Something about it felt wrong. Jason stopped in front of the church, staring at the towering doors. He wasn't a religious man, but there was something about this place that called to him, a whisper deep within his chest urging him to go inside. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the heavy doors open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of incense, and the low hum of prayer filled the space. The dim light from the stained glass windows cast eerie, colorful shadows on the stone floor. Jason's footsteps echoed through the empty hall as he made his way to the front, where a lone priest stood, his back to the entrance. The priest turned slowly when he heard Jason's approach, his eyes narrowing as if he had been expecting him. Jason didn't know why, but the man's gaze sent a shiver down his spine. "You've come to seek answers," the priest said, his voice soft but clear. "I know why you are here." Jason's heart skipped a beat. How could he know? He hadn't said a word. "I don't know what's happening to me," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "There's a mark on my skin. It won't stop growing." The priest studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "The mark is not just a sign, son. It's a curse. You must be careful." Jason's breath caught in his throat. "A curse?" The priest nodded solemnly. "This mark is part of something much older, something that has been passed down through the ages. It carries with it a dark power, a power that will consume you unless you find a way to break free." Jason could barely process the words. A curse? Was this really happening? His mind raced, trying to understand what the priest meant. How could a mark on his skin hold such power? "I don't know how to stop it," Jason said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What should I do?" The priest didn't answer right away. He looked deep into Jason's eyes, as if searching for something. Finally, he spoke. "The curse is tied to the beast, a force much older than you can imagine. It is feeding on you slowly until there's nothing left. But there is a way to break it." Jason's heart began to race. "How? How do I stop it?" The priest hesitated before answering. "You must go to the Hollow Hill. There you will find what you need to stop the curse. But beware. Once you set foot on that hill, you will face the beast. It will try to claim you. You must be prepared." Jason's mind spun. The Hollow Hill? He had heard the name before, but he didn't know much about it. It was just a strange place in town, a hill where people whispered rumors of dark rituals and cursed grounds. But a hill that could help him break a curse? It seemed like madness. But as he looked at the priest, his words resonated within him. The mark on his skin was growing stronger, spreading further with every passing day. If this was his only chance to stop it, he would have to take it. Jason left the church with a heavy heart, his thoughts consumed by the priest's words. The Hollow Hill. He didn't know what awaited him there, but he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't go, the mark would claim him. Jason couldn't shake the priest's words from his mind. The Hollow Hill. What was it about this place that could break the curse? As the hours passed, his fear grew, mixing with a strange sense of urgency. He knew he had no choice but to go, but the idea of facing whatever was waiting for him there terrified him. The mark on his arm had grown again. It now crawled up his forearm, creeping further each day like a living thing. It was hard to ignore. Even when he tried to distract himself, It kept pulling at his thoughts, like a dark cloud hanging over him. He could feel its weight, as if it was drawing him in, and the more he resisted, the more it seemed to spread. He had to leave. He couldn't let it consume him. That night, he packed a small bag. He didn't know how long he would be gone or what he might need, but he felt a compulsion to prepare. His mind raced with questions. Was the hollow hill even real? What would he find there? And most importantly, could he survive whatever lay ahead? By the time the sun set, Jason was standing at the edge of town, staring at the road that would take him to the hill. The streets were eerily quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He had never felt so alone. The darkness around him seemed to close in as he walked, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The mark burned on his arm, a constant reminder of what he was about to face. As he reached the outskirts of town, he saw the hill in the distance. It was a silhouette against the darkening sky, towering over the land like an ominous giant. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway and groan as if they were trying to warn him. Despite the chill in the air, Jason felt a wave of heat rise from his chest, his pulse quickening. Something about this place felt wrong, unnatural. He reached the foot of the hill, and as he began to climb, the air grew colder. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the hill itself was pushing against him. Jason's breath was shallow as he continued, the mark on his arm now throbbing in time with his heartbeat. He could feel it pulling him forward, urging him to keep going, even though every instinct in him screamed to turn back. At the top of the hill, Jason paused. The landscape before him was covered in mist, and a faint, otherworldly glow seemed to emanate from the ground. It wasn't the light of the moon or the stars. It was something different, something dark and ancient. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, with jagged rocks protruding from the earth. Jason felt a cold breeze whip through the air, carrying with it a faint whisper. He strained to listen, but it was too faint to understand. The whispering grew louder as he stepped forward, until it seemed to surround him from all sides. He looked around, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing. Only the mist, thick and swirling, as if it was alive. A feeling of dread washed over him, and he had to fight the urge to run. Jason! The voice was clear now, as if it was coming from the very air around him. It sent a chill down his spine. He didn't know where it was coming from, but it was unmistakable. He froze, heart pounding, eyes wide. He felt the mark on his arm flare with heat, and it almost felt like it was alive, as if the voice had woken something within it. "Jason, you are here," the voice said again, and this time Jason recognized it. It was the same voice he had heard in his dreams, the one that had haunted him for days. "Who are you?" Jason whispered, his voice shaking with fear. There was a pause before the voice responded, its tone soft and sinister. "I am the one who has claimed you. I have been waiting for you, Jason. You cannot escape me." The mark on his arm burned hotter, and Jason could feel it spreading, inch by inch. His skin felt like it was being scorched. Panic surged within him, and he instinctively reached for it. But the moment his fingers touched the mark, a surge of pain shot through his entire body. It was as if something deep inside him was awakening, something dark and terrible. He stumbled back, trying to tear himself away, but the voice continued, its words seeping into his mind, filling him with dread. "You cannot outrun your fate, Jason. The mark you bear is the price you must pay. You are mine now, and there is no turning back." Jason tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. His legs felt weak beneath him, his vision blurring as the pain from the mark grew more intense. His body trembled, and he sank to his knees, gasping for breath. The mist around him thickened, swirling like a storm. He heard whispers again, but they were louder now, growing in volume and intensity. His head spun, and for a moment, he thought he saw shapes moving in the fog, figures, cloaked in shadows, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the mist, its outline becoming clearer with each passing second. It was tall and cloaked, its face hidden beneath the hood of its dark robe. The figure's presence was overwhelming, filling the air with an oppressive force. Jason's heart raced as it approached him, the voice in his mind growing louder, more insistent. "You've come to me," the figure said, its voice like a hiss. "And now you will be mine. Forever." Jason's eyes widened in terror. He tried to stand, but his body refused to obey. The mark on his arm throbbed, burning deeper into his skin, as if the figure's words were sinking into his very soul. The figure raised its hand, and the mist around Jason thickened even more. He could no longer breathe, his chest constricted as if a heavy weight was pressing down on him. His vision darkened, and he felt himself falling into the abyss. Before he lost consciousness, the last thing he heard was the voice, now louder than ever, whispering in his ear, "You belong to me now." Jason woke with a start, gasping for air as if he'd been submerged underwater. His body was drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The world around him was blurry, the air thick and heavy. It took a moment for his mind to clear, and when it did, he realized he was no longer on the hill. The ground beneath him was cold and hard, the scent of damp earth lingering in the air. His head ached, a dull throb that made his vision swim. He sat up, groaning, trying to make sense of where he was. The mist had disappeared, and in its place was a dense, dark forest. The trees towered above him, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers. It was silent, too quiet, except for the faint sound of something scraping against the ground. Jason's eyes darted around, trying to locate the source of the noise, but there was nothing, just shadows. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky, and the burning mark on his arm flared up again, sending a shock of pain through him. His breath hitched, and he instinctively reached for it, his fingers trembling as he traced the edges of the mark. It had spread further, winding up his arm like a dark vine, and now it pulsed with an unnatural heat. His mind raced, remembering the voice, the figure from the hill. He had heard its words, felt its power. Had it been a dream, or was it real? He didn't know anymore. All he could feel now was the pull of the mark, urging him onward, driving him deeper into the forest. Despite the fear gnawing at him, Jason knew he couldn't stay here. The mark was leading him, guiding him like a force he couldn't escape. Every step he took was heavier than the last, as if something invisible was pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shadows in the trees were alive, waiting for him to make a mistake. He forced himself to keep walking, his footsteps crunching softly on the dry leaves beneath him. The air grew colder, and a strange chill seeped into his bones. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, breathing around him, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind him. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. His heart raced, his body tense with fear. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness of the trees, silent and still. He took a step forward, then another, but the rustling came again, closer this time. His pulse quickened, and the mark burned hotter against his skin, like it was alive, urging him to run. Another step, and the rustling stopped. Jason's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight with anxiety. He forced himself to keep moving, faster now, trying to ignore the panic rising inside him. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him gave way. Jason stumbled, falling to the earth with a sharp gasp, his arms flailing as he tried to catch himself. He hit the ground hard, his head colliding with the dirt. Pain exploded in his skull, but he pushed through it, trying to regain his balance. When he looked up, he found himself staring into the black void of a deep hole in the ground. The edges of the hole were jagged, like broken teeth, and the dark interior seemed to swallow up any light that came near it. Jason swallowed hard, fear rising in his chest. The mark on his arm burned like fire, and he instinctively knew that this was where he had been led. This was where he needed to go. He hesitated, his body trembling, but the pull of the mark was undeniable. It was like a magnetic force drawing him in. With a final glance over his shoulder, he stepped forward, letting his body fall into the hole. The world around him spun as he plummeted, darkness closing in around him like a suffocating blanket. He landed with a thud, the air knocked out of his lungs. He lay there for a moment, trying to catch his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the forest. The air was thick, damp, and cold, and the ground was uneven beneath him. He slowly pushed himself to his feet, his mind foggy and disoriented. As he looked around, his stomach churned with unease. He was in a cave. The walls were rough and jagged, covered in strange markings that seemed to pulse with a dim, eerie light. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something foul like decay. His breath hitched as he realized the ground beneath him was slick with something dark and viscous. The mark on his arm burned more intensely now, the heat radiating from it like a living thing. It felt like it was eating into his skin, digging deeper into his flesh with every passing second. He had to find out what was happening, what this was all leading to. But the further he went into the cave, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Jason's footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound seeming to stretch into eternity. It was as if the cave was swallowing him whole, each step taking him deeper into the darkness. And yet, the mark on his arm seemed to glow brighter, its tendrils creeping further along his skin. Then he heard it, a low, guttural sound, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, but it was unmistakable. The voice was familiar. It was the same voice he had heard on the hill. "You've come far, Jason." His heart skipped a beat, his blood running cold. The voice was all around him now, swirling through the air, filling every corner of the cave. "You think you can escape me?" The voice continued, its tone dark and mocking. "You are already mine. The mark you wear is my gift to you, a gift that will bring you closer to your fate." Jason's hands clenched into fists, his teeth gritted in defiance. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the darkness, his voice hoarse with fear and anger. The voice laughed, a chilling sound that made Jason's skin crawl. "I want what is mine, and you will give it to me, willingly or not." Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled, and the cave seemed to shake with an unnatural force. The walls closed in, the strange markings glowing brighter, and the air grew thick with an oppressive pressure. Jason's breath quickened as the dark presence in the cave grew stronger, more tangible. He could feel it, something ancient, something evil waiting for him. "You cannot run from me, Jason," the voice whispered, its tone now laced with malice. "You are already too far gone." Jason tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The mark on his arm burned like a wildfire, and the pain was unbearable. His knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, unable to stand. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, consuming him from the inside out. The voice was louder now, closer, as if it was standing right behind him. "It's too late. You belong to me." Jason's mind raced, the world spinning around him as the voice echoed in his head. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest, his body frozen in place as if the very air around him had turned to stone. The pain in his arm was unbearable, a searing heat that made his vision blur with tears. "I won't do it," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. But even as the words left his lips, they felt hollow, like a lie he was trying to tell himself. The voice laughed again, a deep, chilling sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the cave. "You've already done it, Jason. The moment you accepted the mark, you sealed your fate. There's no turning back now." His breath caught in his throat, and he tried to push himself up, to stand, to run. But his body wouldn't respond. The mark burned hotter, as if it was physically restraining him, holding him in place. He could feel the weight of it, the force of it pressing down on him. The darkness around him seemed to grow thicker, the shadows stretching out like long, dark fingers. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for something, anything, to help him escape. But all he saw was the cave, the walls closing in, the strange markings that glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. "You belong to me now," the voice said softly, its tone both cruel and reassuring. "And soon you will do as I ask. It's the only way to survive." Jason shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "What do you want from me? What's the point of all this?" The cave seemed to shift, the air thickening, the very ground beneath him trembling. He could hear something moving in the darkness, something big, something that didn't belong in this world. His heart raced, fear clawing at his insides. "You'll see soon enough," the voice replied, its tone almost kind, like it was explaining something to a child. "But first, you must understand the true nature of the mark." Jason closed his eyes, trying to block out the voice, the fear that was clawing at him. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to know what came next. But the mark on his arm burned brighter than ever, and the pain was growing unbearable. His body felt as if it were on fire, and he couldn't escape it. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he opened his eyes. The cave had changed. The walls, once jagged and rough, now seemed smooth, as if they had been carved by some ancient force. The air was thick with the scent of something foul, decay, rot, the stench of death itself. And in the distance, Jason saw a figure. It was tall, shrouded in shadows, its form hard to make out. But Jason could feel its presence, like an oppressive weight that pressed down on him, suffocating him. The figure moved slowly, purposefully, its steps echoing in the cave as it approached. Jason's breath quickened, his heart thundering in his chest. "Who are you?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, and Jason's eyes widened as he saw it. An ancient, twisted symbol carved into the figure's palm. It was the same symbol as the mark on his arm. "You are mine," the voice whispered again, now louder, more powerful. "You will serve me, just like all those before you." Jason felt a surge of panic as the figure drew closer. The air around him crackled with a dark energy, and he could feel the presence of something far more terrifying than he could ever imagine. His thoughts raced, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. How had it come to this? How had he ended up here, in this godforsaken cave, facing something so evil, so ancient? The figure stopped in front of him, its face hidden in the shadows. Jason could feel its eyes on him, cold and unblinking. His body trembled, but he refused to look away. "This is your fate, Jason," the voice said, its tone soft but firm. You were chosen long ago. The mark was placed upon you for a reason. You will bring about the end, just as I have planned." The figure reached out and touched the mark on Jason's arm, and a shock of cold electricity ran through him, making him gasp in pain. He wanted to pull away, but the figure's touch was like iron, holding him in place. "Soon," the voice whispered, "soon you will understand. The mark is just the beginning. It is the key to everything. And you, Jason, are the one who will unlock it." Jason tried to speak, to fight back, but his throat was dry, his words trapped in his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt as though the very air around him was thickening, crushing him under its weight. The figure pulled its hand back and stepped away. "Come," it said, the voice now low and commanding. "It's time to begin." Jason's mind screamed for him to run, to escape, but his body was no longer his own. The mark on his arm burned with an intensity he had never known, and he felt himself being pulled forward, drawn toward the figure, toward the unknown. He stumbled after it, his legs unsteady, the weight of the mark dragging him down. The figure led him deeper into the cave, past strange carvings and symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The further they went, the darker it became, the air colder, the walls pressing in tighter. Jason's mind was a blur, his thoughts clouded by fear, by the voice, by the pull of the mark. It was as if his entire existence had been reduced to this moment, this place. There was no escaping it. He was trapped, caught in a web of darkness that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. They reached the heart of the cave, a vast chamber filled with an eerie, unnatural light. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, its surface covered in strange symbols that Jason couldn't understand. The figure stood beside it, its face still hidden in the shadows. "This is where it begins," the voice said, its tone filled with anticipation. Jason wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but he couldn't. His body was no longer his own. The mark, the figure, the voice, they controlled him now. The figure motioned toward the altar, its hand reaching for him. "Lie down," it commanded. Jason felt his body moving on its own, stepping toward the altar, lying down without his consent. His eyes stared up at the cold stone ceiling, the darkness pressing in around him. He could feel the presence of the figure, looming over him, and the voice was louder now, filling his mind. "Soon, Jason," it whispered. "Soon you will understand. The mark is just the beginning. The end is near." Jason's heart raced as he lay on the cold stone altar. The air in the cavern was thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in on him. Every breath felt like a struggle, his chest tightening with fear. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, his body refusing to obey him. The mark on his arm burned with a sickening intensity, and he could feel it spreading, crawling deeper under his skin, like something alive. The figure stood beside him, its form still obscured in the shadows. Jason could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on him. The voice, now louder, more insistent, seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in his head, filling his thoughts. "You're almost there," the voice whispered, its tone soft and soothing, but there was something dark and twisted beneath the calm. "You've come so far, Jason. You've accepted the mark. Now you must accept what comes next." Jason wanted to scream, wanted to push himself off the altar and run, but his body refused to respond. It felt as if invisible chains were wrapped around him, holding him down. The more he fought, the stronger the pull became. The mark burned brighter, hotter, like a living thing crawling beneath his flesh. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the pain, the voice, the darkness that surrounded him. But it was impossible. Every time he tried to escape, It dragged him back in, deeper, further into the nightmare. "You can't run from this," the voice continued, its tone almost affectionate. "You can't fight it. It's part of you now. The mark is your fate, Jason. The end is inevitable. But don't worry, you'll understand soon. You'll understand why you were chosen." Jason's breath came in shallow gasps. His body was trembling, the cold stone beneath him sending a chill through his bones. His mind felt like it was on fire, the mark's influence growing stronger with every passing second. It was as if something dark was taking root inside him, something ancient and powerful. The figure moved closer, and Jason could feel the air shift, growing colder, heavier. A cold hand brushed against his forehead, sending a shiver through his entire body. He tried to jerk away, but he couldn't move. He could only lie there, helpless, as the figure loomed over him. "Look at me, Jason," the voice commanded. Reluctantly, Jason opened his eyes, his vision blurred with tears. The figure was still shrouded in shadow, its face hidden in darkness. But he could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, on him. The presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "You have to embrace this," the voice said, its tone growing darker. "You have to accept what's coming, or it will destroy you." Jason felt a surge of panic. "I don't want this. I don't want any of this," he shouted, though his voice was weak, desperate. "Please, just let me go." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out and placed its hand on Jason's chest. The touch was ice cold, sending a shockwave of fear through him. The mark on his arm burned with an unbearable intensity, and for a moment, Jason thought he might die from the pain. It felt like something was trying to rip its way out of him, tearing through his flesh, his soul. But then, just as suddenly, the pain stopped. Jason gasped for air, his chest heaving as the pressure on him lifted. He sat up, his body trembling uncontrollably. The figure was still there, but now it seemed to be waiting, watching him. What happened?" Jason whispered, his voice hoarse, raw. "You've taken the first step," the voice answered, its tone almost gentle now. "The mark has begun its work. You'll feel it every day, growing stronger, spreading further. But don't worry, I'll be here to guide you." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Guide me? To what? What do you want from me?" The figure stepped back, its form slowly coming into focus. The shadows seemed to melt away, revealing a tall, thin figure cloaked in tattered black robes. The face was still hidden, but Jason could make out the faint outline of a hood, the dark, empty space beneath it. "You'll know soon enough," the voice replied. "All you have to do is follow the path. The mark will lead you. It's already inside you, Jason. It's already changing you." Jason's breath caught in his throat. He could feel it, deep inside, something crawling under his skin, something dark and malevolent. He could feel the mark pulsing, spreading further, consuming him. It was as if the very essence of it was slowly taking over his body, his mind. "Don't fight it," the figure said, its voice now softer, more soothing. "You'll only make it worse. Accept what is happening. It's your destiny. The mark is the key to everything." Jason's mind reeled. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse racing. "I don't understand," he muttered, barely able to speak. "What is the mark? What does it mean?" The figure remained silent for a long moment. When it finally spoke, its voice was cold, detached. "It's the mark of the beast," it said, "the beginning of the end. And you, Jason, are the one who will bring it." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He felt his breath catch in his throat, his stomach twisting with fear. The beast? The end? What did it all mean? And why him? Why had he been chosen? "You are the key," the figure continued, its voice growing fainter now, as if it were slipping away. "You will open the door. And when you do, everything will change." The figure's presence began to fade, its form dissolving into the darkness. Jason's heart raced, the panic rising again as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. He was left alone in the cavern, the silence deafening, the darkness pressing in around him. The mark on his arm burned brighter than ever, spreading further, its power growing stronger with each passing moment. Jason's head spun, and he could feel the weight of it, the heaviness of his fate, crushing him. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The mark, the figure, the voice, it was all part of him now. There was no escaping it. The end was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jason woke up with a start, his body drenched in cold sweat. His heart was pounding so loudly in his chest that it drowned out everything else. The room around him was dark, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. But it felt different. The air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on him, suffocating him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to explain the unease that crawled under his skin. The mark, it was still there, burning against his arm, the skin hot to the touch. He quickly pulled up his sleeve, and there it was, the dark, twisted symbol he had first seen days ago. But now it was worse. The mark had spread, creeping up his arm, curling its way toward his shoulder. His breath hitched in his throat. He had thought it was a dream, the figure, the dark presence, but now he wasn't so sure. What had happened to him? What was happening to his body? He tried to shake off the fog in his mind, to push through the fear that clawed at him. But the more he tried to ignore it, the worse it got. The mark seemed to pulse, throbbing in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if it was alive. Jason stood up, his legs trembling beneath him. He couldn't stay here. He had to get out of the house, get away from everything that was pulling him down into this nightmare. He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the door, but before he could reach the handle, there was a knock. Light, but insistent. Jason froze, the blood draining from his face. Who could it be? He didn't want anyone to see him like this. He didn't want to face anyone, especially not with that mark spreading across his skin. He took a deep breath and tried to steady himself before slowly walking toward the door. When he opened it, he was greeted by the last person he expected to see. Emily. "Jason," she said, her voice soft, but with an edge of concern. "I had a feeling you'd be here. We need to talk." Jason stepped back, allowing her to enter, his mind racing. Emily's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of worry and something else, something deeper. He wasn't sure if he could trust her anymore, not with what was happening to him, not with the things he'd seen. "What's going on, Emily?" Jason asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Why are you here?" She looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. "I know what's happening to you," she said quietly. "I know about the mark." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "You know about it?" He could feel his pulse quickening, panic rising in his chest. "How? Who told you?" Emily swallowed hard, her eyes flickering to the mark on his arm. "I didn't want to believe it at first," she admitted. "But I've seen the same thing, the same mark, and I've heard the stories." Jason felt a chill run through him. "What stories?" Emily took a step closer, lowering her voice. "The mark, it's not just a symbol. It's a curse. The one who bears it is bound to a fate darker than death. And every day it spreads, bringing them closer to their end. No one who has had the mark has ever escaped." Jason felt his knees grow weak, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to tell her it wasn't true, that there had to be some mistake. But he couldn't. He could feel the mark burning against his skin, its power growing with each passing moment. "It's too late," Emily whispered. "You can't stop it. But there might still be a way to end it." Jason looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What do you mean? What can I do?" Emily looked away, her hands trembling. "I don't know, but I've heard of a way. There's someone who can help. Someone who can reverse it." Jason felt a flicker of hope in his chest, but it quickly faded, replaced by doubt. Who can help me?" Emily hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a healer, a woman who lives on the outskirts of town. She's known for helping people with curses like yours. But there's a price." Jason's heart sank. "A price? What kind of price?" "I don't know," Emily admitted, her voice shaking. "No one ever comes back the same. But it's the only chance you have." Jason's mind was racing. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't live with this mark spreading, controlling him, taking over his life. But what if the healer wasn't the answer? What if the price was too high? But he didn't have a choice. He had to try. "I'll go," he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "I have to." Emily nodded, her face pale. "I'll come with you. But be careful, Jason. Whatever you do, don't make a deal with her. Don't agree to anything unless you know exactly what it will cost you." Jason didn't know if he could trust Emily anymore, but he didn't have time to question her now. The mark on his arm was spreading too quickly, and every second felt like it might be his last. They left the house together, stepping into the cold night air. The streets were empty, silent, the only sound their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Jason's mind was spinning, his heart racing as they walked toward the edge of town. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, the weight of the mark dragging him down. As they reached the outskirts of town, the streets grew quieter, the houses farther apart. The air felt different here, darker, heavier, like it was holding its breath. And then, in the distance, Jason saw it. The house. It was small, almost hidden among the trees, its windows dark and uninviting. The place had an aura of unease around it, like it was a place where things shouldn't be. But Jason had no choice. He had to face whatever was inside. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, Emily close behind him. The house loomed in front of them, dark and silent, as though it had been waiting for Jason's arrival. The trees surrounding it seemed to bend inwards, casting long, crooked shadows on the ground. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. Jason could almost feel the house breathing, watching them. His heart pounded in his chest as he took one cautious step forward, his breath shaky. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Are you sure this is the place?" Emily nodded, her face pale, eyes filled with fear. "This is it. We have no other choice. We have to go in." Jason could feel the cold sweat beading on his forehead, but he knew there was no turning back. The mark on his arm burned more fiercely than ever, its tendrils creeping further up his skin. Every pulse of pain was a reminder that time was running out. He reached for the door, his hand shaking as he grasped the old brass handle. It felt cold, like it had been untouched for years. With a deep breath, he twisted it and pushed the door open. A low creak echoed through the stillness as the door slowly gave way. The house was dark, and the air inside felt thick, almost suffocating. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The place was abandoned, the walls covered in dust and cobwebs. The smell of age and decay clung to the air, as though the house itself was dying. But there was something else, something more unsettling. It was as if the house was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. "Hello," Emily called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. Jason moved cautiously through the entryway, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. The place felt empty, but there was a sense of unease in the air. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. They continued deeper into the house, passing through rooms filled with old, forgotten furniture and broken fixtures. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. Yet, there was a strange sense of familiarity in the air, as if the walls themselves knew what had brought Jason here. At the end of the hallway, they came to a door. It was smaller than the others, tucked away in a corner as though it had been deliberately hidden. Jason hesitated for a moment, his heart thumping in his chest. But Emily was already reaching for the handle, her hand steady, her eyes filled with determination. "Are you sure we should?" Jason started, but Emily was already pushing the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything Jason had seen. It was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small candle flickering on a table in the center of the room. There was an old woman sitting at the table, her face obscured by the shadows. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she seemed to be waiting, as if she had been expecting them. Emily stepped forward, her voice low but urgent. "We've come to see you. We need your help." The woman's head tilted slightly, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something ancient and knowing. Jason could feel the weight of her stare, like she could see straight through him, into the very depths of his soul. "What is it you seek?" the woman asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper, yet it filled the room. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry. I have a mark," he said, his voice shaking. "It's spreading. It's taking over my body, and I can't stop it. I need help. Please." The woman's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "Ah, the mark," she said, her voice carrying an odd sense of satisfaction. "I've seen it before." Jason felt a chill run through him. "What is it? What does it mean?" The woman leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "The mark is not just a symbol," she said, her voice darkening. "It is a binding, a pact made with forces beyond your understanding. And once the mark has chosen you, there is no turning back." Jason's heart raced, his breath coming in quick gasps. "What do you mean? How do I stop it?" The woman's smile faded, and she leaned back in her chair. "Stopping it is not so simple," she said, her voice taking on a deeper tone. "There is a price to be paid, a price that must be accepted, for the mark does not forgive." Jason's mind spun. "I'll do anything," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I can't live like this. Please, tell me what I have to do." The woman's gaze softened, just for a moment, before it turned cold once more. "There is a way," she said slowly, "but it comes with a heavy cost. The mark can be removed, but not without sacrifice. You must give something in return." Jason felt a pit form in his stomach. "What kind of sacrifice?" The woman's smile returned, a dark, knowing expression. "You will lose something precious, something you cannot live without. That is the price." Jason felt a wave of panic wash over him. No, I can't lose anything more. I can't." "But the mark is already taking from you," the woman interrupted, her voice like ice. "Each day, it consumes more of your soul. If you do nothing, it will claim you entirely. It is not just a physical curse. It is one of the spirit." Jason's mind raced. He didn't want to lose anything else, but what choice did he have? The mark was eating away at him, at his very soul. If he didn't do something, he would be lost forever. "I'll do it," Jason said, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. "I'll pay the price. Just make it stop." The woman nodded slowly, as if she had expected him to say that. She reached out, placing her cold, bony hand on his arm, where the mark was now almost fully spread. "Then the bargain is struck," she said softly. "You will be freed of the mark, but the cost will be more than you can imagine." Jason felt a sharp pain shoot through his arm, like something was being torn from him. The mark burned, then seemed to pull away, fading as though it was never there. But the pain didn't stop. It continued, deeper, colder, and it was as though something inside him was being ripped apart. The room spun around him, and he staggered backward, his vision going black. As the days passed, the mark on Ethan's skin spread further, as if it had a life of its own. The once small, dark symbol now stretched across his entire arm, a deep, searing crimson that burned like fire. Every morning, he woke up with new, twisted patterns that would appear overnight, spiraling up his arm and chest. The pain was unbearable, but worse was the sensation. The sense that something was watching him, waiting for the final moment to arrive. Ethan had no choice but to seek help. He remembered the old woman, Margaret, the one who had warned him about the curse. He found her living on the outskirts of town, in a dilapidated cottage, surrounded by thick fog. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She had known this day would come. "You've been marked, Ethan," she said, her voice low and filled with sorrow. "It is too late to stop it now. The mark, it calls to the beast." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had heard rumors, stories told in hushed whispers by those who knew too much about the occult. The beast, a dark force that had existed for centuries, marking those who were fated to become its next victim. But Margaret's words carried a weight of finality that chilled him to the bone. "I don't want to be its victim," Ethan pleaded. "Please, help me. There must be a way." Margaret's eyes softened, but the sadness remained. "There is a way, but it is not a path anyone would choose to walk. The mark was placed on you for a reason, and now it is drawing the beast to you. If you do not face it head-on, if you do not embrace your fate, the creature will claim your soul." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Ethan felt a cold wave of dread wash over him as Margaret placed her gnarled hands over the mark on his arm. The heat that emanated from the symbol was unbearable, but Margaret's touch was soothing. "Listen to me, Ethan. You must find the source of the mark. It is hidden beneath the earth, beneath the very town you live in. The creature is tied to the land, and it is only through confronting it there that you can sever the bond." The words echoed in Ethan's mind, and a dreadful sense of urgency filled him. Time was running out. The beast was closer than ever. The cold wind outside rattled the shutters of Margaret's cottage as Ethan stood, frozen, his mind racing with the implications of her words. There was no more time to waste. The mark on his skin burned like it was alive, and each passing minute brought the beast closer. The darkness was drawing nearer, creeping into every corner of his mind and soul. "How do I get there?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper, laden with fear and determination. Margaret gave him a long, appraising look before answering, her eyes narrowing as if reading something hidden deep within him. "You must go to the town's graveyard. Beneath the oldest mausoleum is the entrance to what you seek. But beware, Ethan, for the beast will be waiting for you. It has sensed your presence, and it is preparing to claim its prize." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. The beast, the mark, the darkness, it was all connected. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He had become part of a much darker, ancient story, one he couldn't escape from, no matter how hard he tried. With Margaret's directions in his mind, he left the cottage, heading for the graveyard as the sun dipped below the horizon. The town, once familiar and comforting, now seemed foreign, almost hostile, as if the very streets were alive and watching him. The weight of the mark seemed to grow heavier with every step he took. When he reached the graveyard, the air grew thick with an eerie stillness. The tombstones were aged, cracked, as though they had been forgotten by time. But the mausoleum, the oldest one at the far end of the cemetery, stood out, its stone doors weathered and worn, as if it had witnessed centuries of secrets. Ethan approached the mausoleum, his heart pounding in his chest. The darkness seemed to cling to him, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. He could hear whispers in the wind, faint but persistent, like voices from another world, beckoning him to enter. He pushed the heavy stone doors open. Inside, it was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay. The floor beneath his feet was uneven, and as he ventured deeper into the mausoleum, his steps echoed, hollow and unnatural. The walls were lined with strange symbols, etched into the stone, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The same symbols he had seen in his nightmares, in the mark on his skin. Then, in the very center of the mausoleum, he saw it. A dark, swirling vortex in the ground, its edges shifting and writhing like a living thing. It was the source, the beast's lair, the very heart of the curse. Ethan could feel its pull, its hunger. He knew what he had to do, but fear gripped him tightly. He had come this far, but was he strong enough to face what lay beneath? As he stepped closer to the vortex, the ground trembled beneath him, and a low growl echoed from deep within. The beast was awakening, the mark on Ethan's arm seared with unbearable pain, as though it were trying to tear him apart from the inside out. He fell to his knees, clutching his arm, struggling to breathe as the darkness surrounded him. The air grew thick with the stench of death, and he could feel the beast's presence, its eyes watching, waiting for him to make his move. He stood shakily, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. He was no longer just running from the beast. Now he was fighting for his life, for his soul. The creature would not claim him. Not today. With a scream, Ethan plunged his hand into the swirling vortex, feeling the raw, pulsating energy of the creature flow through him. The pain was unbearable, but he fought it. The darkness clawed at him, trying to pull him in, but Ethan held on. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, blinding and brilliant, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The vortex disappeared, the beast's presence vanished, and the mark on Ethan's skin burned one last time before fading away completely. Ethan collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The weight of the curse finally lifted from him. But the silence in the mausoleum was deafening. He knew in that moment that he had won, at least for now. The beast was gone, but he could still feel its lingering presence, like a shadow at the edge of his consciousness, waiting for another opportunity to strike. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. As he stood, shaken but resolute, Ethan looked back at the now empty mausoleum. He had faced the darkness and survived, but the mark of the beast would forever haunt him, a reminder of the horrors that lurked just beneath the surface of his world. The curse had been broken, but the scars would remain.